Well, Dave, thank you so much for that very gracious introduction, and thank all of you very much for being here this evening and giving me the privilege of being with you on a wonderful early spring evening. I was remarking earlier that the challenge for me tonight is going to be to not be distracted by the gorgeous views out the window. I have a sense of closeness and affection for Colorado. My sister lives up the road in Loveland, and I have an opportunity to come out to the Denver area from time to time, and I always really relish those opportunities. So it's a privilege for me to be here. The speakers that Dave mentioned are absolutely first class, and I'm honored to be in that category of sort of participating in the same series that they are. I know both Zach Carabell and Dan Wright, and again, a terrific group of folks. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm grateful to the World Affairs Council here in the Denver and Golden area. Let me just start this evening with one other comment, and that is I was very privileged this evening to have the opportunity to sit at the table with the students from Stanley Lake High School. And I have to say I was extremely impressed with their mastery and knowledge of foreign affairs and international relations, and their understanding of the key issues that we're facing in the world today, and for that matter, here in the United States. And I just want to say it was very inspiring to be able to share dinner with you. I wish you the very best in Washington. I'll be pulling for you, and I wish you good luck in that contest, the World Quest contest. Thank you so much. Now, let me just start as I kind of get into my own comments with what I would say is kind of a prelude or preface to what I'd like to say. I think in some ways tonight is really a story of two powers. One is established, the other is rising. One has already logged great achievements, the other believes that great things are ahead. One is dominant in the air, the other is formidable on the ground. Both are fiercely competitive, and the competition between the two will have profound implications for the wider community. There are even some who wonder whether, metaphorically speaking, this town is big enough for the both of them. But enough about Peyton Manning and Tim Tebow. Let's talk about China and the United States. I thought a lot on the airplane. How could I start out tonight? And I just came up with something that I hope shows that I'm paying attention to what really matters here in Denver. I would like to talk about the topic of Chinese foreign policy and U.S. security interests in Asia. I think it is a timely and important topic that has implications, in fact, for all of us. And it's an opportune moment for us to come together and talk about this very important bilateral relationship. The point was made earlier that I think Dave mentioned, there really is no bilateral relationship between two countries on earth that is more important than that between the United States and China in many different ways. And what happens with U.S.-China relations going forward is really, in fact, going to have a very profound impact on the world. So tonight, what I would like to do is talk about four basic things. One, I want to lay out a few general thoughts about Chinese foreign policy. Not necessarily specific Chinese foreign policies, but rather a larger framework within which to understand and frame Chinese foreign policy. Secondly, I want to talk about, as the title of the presentation suggests, U.S. security interests in the Asian region. Third, I then want to talk about how Chinese foreign policy doctrine and how specific Chinese foreign policies line up or don't line up with U.S. interests and where the challenges are in this important bilateral relationship. And then finally, I'll offer a few concluding remarks. And then most importantly, in the 42 seconds that we'll have after all of that, before we have to end at, I think, 8:45 or so. No, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments from you. Anytime I have the privilege of being able to speak to a World Affairs Council, whether here in the Colorado foothills or elsewhere, the thing that I enjoy the most and certainly learn from the most are the great questions and comments. So I do hope we'll have perhaps 20 or 25 minutes, and I'll try to keep my remarks around the 30 or 35-minute mark. So with that basic preface, let me just say that Chinese foreign policy is a big and complex topic, and one could go about talking about it in various different ways. What I would like to do now, as I alluded to in my kind of mapping out of tonight's presentation, is to look at the big picture of Chinese foreign policy and to try to understand at kind of a doctrinal level what are the fundamental attributes and objectives of Chinese foreign policy, and what is a framework within which we can make sense of the various things, the myriad things that China does as a nation. If you look at any one particular policy in a vacuum, it doesn't necessarily make sense. But if you look at all of the different policies in the context of a broader framework, I think it starts to come together, and you start to see a predictability and a kind of rationality to China's foreign policy. So with that in mind, let me start with a couple of basic observations. Number one, I think it's important to talk about what I would call the first principle of Chinese policy generally. And I think it's true of both foreign policy, but also true of domestic policy. But since tonight we're focusing on foreign policy, I'll focus on the foreign policy aspect of it. So the first principle of Chinese foreign policy is actually the maintenance of the Chinese system and the maintenance of the primacy of the Communist Party of China in that system. That is the first principle. It is the number one priority, and it is the fundamental aim of policy in China, foreign and domestic, from which everything else derives. Now, some may say, or upon hearing that, well, is that kind of a harsh way of stating it? That, gee, these leaders just want to keep themselves in power. But what I would point out is, if you look, as I have and many others, at the Chinese Constitution, at Article 1, and in fact even the preamble of the Chinese Constitution, Article 1 states that China is and must always be a socialist system. And it also states that China's form of government is what they call, and again I'm quoting the official Chinese translation, a people's democratic dictatorship. A people's democratic dictatorship. That's exactly the term that the Chinese themselves use. And that's in the first sentence of the Chinese Constitution. In the preamble, or the preamble of the Constitution, it also makes it very clear that the Communist Party of China has the leading role in Chinese society, in Chinese politics, in China, period. And so, even looking at this simply through the prism of China's Constitution, much as observers might look at the United States Constitution and discern how foreign policy flows from that document and the division of powers and so on that are articulated therein. So too, if you look at China's own constitution, you'll see that the first thing that is stated is that the Communist Party has to be in power, it must be a socialist system, and the form of government is a dictatorship, or more specifically, a people's democratic dictatorship. Now, if you start from the premise that the maintenance of that system, and therefore the party that created the system, is the fundamental objective of the very Constitution, which gives expression to the Chinese, which gives birth basically to the modern Chinese polity, then the question is, then what do Chinese leaders regard as being the best way to do that? And in a nutshell, this leads to the second point, which we might call the second principle, which is economic development. So in the judgment of the Chinese leadership, And in the judgment of the Chinese Communist Party as a whole, and they've been very clear and explicit about this, economic and social development in China is the number one national priority. And I would connect the two by saying, because the leadership has judged that by generating economic growth and social development, that presents the best and clearest path forward to the maintenance of the Chinese socialist system and people's democratic dictatorship. So economic development is absolutely central. And if you look at Chinese foreign policy, but also domestic policy, what you'll see is that everything China does is geared toward that particular objective, which then raises the next logical question. Well, if economic development is the number one policy priority, then what economic circumstances, or what circumstances in terms of foreign policy, create the optimal environment in which economic and social development can flourish? And that's where you start getting into the basic contours of contemporary Chinese foreign policy. So, for example, what are those conditions that are most conducive to rapid economic growth of the type that China has experienced over the last 30 years? Bear in mind, China's had 10% growth every one of the last 30 years. In what I think probably, and Zachary Karabell and others would know better than I do, folks that have delved into the economic side, is probably the longest run of sustained high-level economic growth in the history of humanity, that 30-year period. So how do we sustain that if we're the Chinese leadership? And the answer is you want a country that is at peace. You want to resolve tensions and problems and disputes on your borders so that your young men and women are not fighting wars on your borders. You want stability, both internally and externally. You want clean trade routes that are not obstructed either by pirates or by military conflicts. You want to be able to get your goods to markets overseas so that you can create employment for your people. You want to be able to extract and get energy resources such as oil and natural gas from other countries to your country. You want to be able to get critical mineral resources to your country. So these are the things that you need to have economic development, and economic development is what you need to keep people happy in the country. I should note also that I think there's a very important concept in China. It's not written out anywhere, but I think it's understood to exist. A kind of social contract. And the social contract is very simple. We, the government, will do our utmost to provide stunning levels of economic growth, to lift people out of poverty, to create prosperity for our nation, to create a rising tide that lifts all boats, some faster than others, but nonetheless all of us. And in exchange for all of those things, in apartments and cars and much higher standards of living within one generation or a half generation, in exchange for all of that, you, the people, don't meddle in politics. And that's the basic social contract. That's the basic Faustian bargain, if you will, that is operating in China. And one doesn't have to make a judgment about that to simply observe that that contract is the one that seems to apply today. And as long as, and I think the leadership of China believes, as long as they can provide this growth, then they're doing their end of things, and then the people will look after their end. So that's the dynamic that we're talking about. So I think it's to understand China's foreign policy and how the United States and China deal with each other, you have to, I think, understand these fundamental principles. And it's through these prisms that Chinese leaders look at foreign policy. There's another way to articulate Chinese foreign policy that then builds on these sort of first and second principles. And that is to look at the question of what might be called grand strategy. And there was a terrific article published in the U.S. publication Foreign Affairs by a professor who I happen to know and is very well known, one of China's really top, maybe the top America hand in the country, a tremendous expert on the United States. His name is Wang Jisi. And he published an article that I believe was called China's Grand Strategy, or perhaps In Search of a Grand Strategy. And he made 3 points. He basically said, what is a grand strategy? Well, a grand strategy has to do 3 things. It has to articulate a nation's core interests. It has to identify the principal challenges and threats to those interests. And then it has to come up with a strategy for dealing with the threats to those core interests. It's got to do those 3 things. And so this leads to a conversation and a discussion about what China considers to be its core interests. Now, the term core interests in the Chinese context has a very specific meaning. You might just think I'm kind of using the term core interests, I'm making it up, or I'm just putting 2 words together. But this particular term, this phrase, has a very specific and definite meaning in Chinese foreign policy and in Chinese politics. Basically translated, the term core interest in China means this is an issue that is so important and existential to us that we will fight a war over it if we have to. That is what a core interest is. It is not a term that is used in a random or casual way. It is a term that is used about those things that the Chinese leaders regard as being literally existential issues, issues that go to their to the existence, the continued existence of the regime, of the party, as the ruling party, and China itself. So, what are those core interests? Number one, well, let me just say, I think there are 6 interests that have been identified by the most recent Chinese foreign policy white paper. So China puts together a foreign policy white paper in the same way that the United States periodically, typically about every 4 years, puts together a national security strategy. Our most recent national security strategy was prepared by the Obama administration in 2010. The one before that was prepared by the Bush administration in 2006, and so on. So China's basic equivalent to that is a foreign policy white paper. And in that document, they articulate 6 core interests, of which 4 directly pertain to foreign affairs. So let me just lay those out, because I think everything that China does is in some way bound up with advancing one or the other of these core interests. So number 1, sovereignty. Number 2, national security. Number 3, the territorial integrity of China. Number 4, and I would say related very much to number 3, is the notion of national reunification. Now that very specifically means bringing Taiwan back into the fold. There's a whole issue around Taiwan that I think many of us are aware of, where Taiwan is deemed by the leadership of mainland China to be a renegade province. It is not controlled in a de facto sense by China, but it is part of, quote, one China, a one China that both Taiwan and mainland China, and for that matter, the United States, all recognize at a conceptual level. The question then becomes, well, which China are we talking about? But the issue of Taiwan is very important, and the issue of national reunification is important. So those are the 4 core interests that pertain to foreign policy: sovereignty, national security, territorial integrity, and national reunification. In addition, on the domestic side, and in a sense I hinted at this earlier when I talked about China's constitution, but on the domestic side, the maintenance of China's political system is a core interest. And as I noted, that's articulated in the first sentence of China's constitution. And secondly, economic and social development is a core interest. So what all these things mean is whatever comes in the way of advancing one of those 6 interests is a serious problem from the standpoint of the Chinese government, and they'll do something about it, because these are the 6 pillars, if you will, of Chinese policy. Now, in addition to these fundamental principles or core interests, There are also what I would call some procedural principles that China pays a lot of attention to in terms of its foreign policy and its foreign relations. A lot of countries worry about what we might call the content of foreign policy. For example, increasing democracy and freedom and human rights in Burma, for example. The United States cares a lot about that. Or making sure that South Sudan, doesn't collapse right after it became an independent nation, after it split off from Sudan in a referendum. So they're qualitative issues, content issues that countries concern themselves with. And then there are procedural issues. That is to say, not the what is at issue, but how do we deal with each other? Those kinds of questions. And China places a lot of stock in what we might call the procedural issues. So for them, they articulate it very succinctly in 5 points. And they refer to these 5 points as the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And the first among them is mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Number 2, non-aggression. Number 3, non-interference in the internal affairs of another country. Number 4, equality and mutual benefit. And number 5, peaceful coexistence. Now, the point that I would make here is, as we start to get into a discussion of U.S. interests and how U.S. and Chinese interests match up, particularly in Asia, is that a lot of what the United States and China disagree on is procedural and stylistic, not just substantive. So we may have very different views about what's happening in Burma. We may have very different views, as in fact we do, about what's happening in Syria. We may have very different takes on Iran. We may have very different views about Taiwan or the South China Seas or North Korea, and the list could go on. But we also disagree about how we deal with some of these issues. And you need look no further than a couple of these principles of peaceful coexistence to see where the problem areas are. So China holds fast to the idea of, for example, non-aggression, the second point that I mentioned. And they really take issue with the fact that the United States has often unilaterally or with a group of friendly nations or allies taken matters into its own hands and launched military operations on other sovereign countries. Whether or not China agrees with the objective of the military action, they have a real problem as a philosophical matter and also as a procedural matter with the very fact that we are doing it in that way. So the United States is kind of, both in doctrine and also to a degree in practice, articulated a doctrine of preemption, that basically we reserve the right to go kick somebody else's tail before they can kick ours. And we'll do that anytime we see fit, anywhere we want. We've stated that. That was in one of our national security strategies, and we've acted upon it. And I'm not drawing judgments on that one way or the other, except to say that that's certainly what we've done. And it's very much at odds with how China sees the world, for various reasons. And so we have fundamental tensions between our countries just over how we do things, not just the what, but the how. And that's also true with respect to, for example, the notion of non-interference in the internal affairs of another country. We in this country believe that, sometimes we know best, and therefore we're going to go into a country and show them how it's done. Or we're going to produce human rights reports every year as mandated by the United States Congress and law. And so we produce human rights reports in which we sit in judgment of the human rights picture in every country of the world, with one exception, us. Because by law, the State Department has a mandate, by law, to produce reports on every foreign country in the world, and we do. I drafted substantial sections of those reports for years when I was in Russia and to a lesser degree in China. But China looks at that, and some other countries do as well, and say, well, in a sense, who are you to judge someone else? And aren't you kind of interfering in the foreign affairs, the internal affairs of another country? So these are some of the areas, whether one agrees or disagrees with that criticism, it's clear that there's tension there. So the point I would note, and I don't think it's noted often enough, is that not only are there substantive policy differences between the United States and China, there are also procedural rules of the game differences between our two countries as well. So there's a lot of tension there. Now, with that discussion of Chinese foreign policy at the level of first principles, core interests, grand strategy, and procedural principles, let me talk a little bit about U.S. security interests in Asia and how they relate to China's foreign policies and to some of the things that we've talked about. First and foremost, I think it's very important to note that the Asia-Pacific region is self-evidently important to China because that's where it is, but it's also critically important to the United States. And in fact, both the United States and China refer to the United States as, quote, an Asia-Pacific power. Now, that's kind of interesting when you think about it. We're in North America, we're not in Asia, obviously. Even I know that. And yet even China, which cares a lot, as we've noted, about sovereignty, recognizes America and refers to America officially as an Asia-Pacific power. Which I think is notable because we would, I think, never refer to China as a North American power, even though they share, a coast of the Pacific Ocean. So there is a kind of asymmetry there, but it's rather interesting. The reason it exists is because when you think about it, in this day and age, it's hard to imagine a region that is today more important to the United States than the Asia-Pacific region. Even historically, bear in mind, we have fought 3 major wars in East Asia. Obviously, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And an enormous volume of U.S. trade flows to and from Asia. Canada and Mexico have historically been our number 1 and 2 trading partners. But China has recently overtaken the number 2 spot and is now our second most important trading partner by trade volume. And obviously Japan and the many other booming economies of Asia have been a big part of our growth and our economic story. So there's an economic case. But perhaps also very significantly, Asia happens to be home in the Asia-Pacific region to probably 2 or 3 of the world's most significant hotspots today. 2 or 3 of the places where there is perhaps greater likelihood of military conflagration than almost anywhere in the world, with the, I think, notable exception of Iran, which obviously is in the news as well. But when you think about East Asia, we think about North Korea, a place that a few weeks ago the United States thought we had a deal with to deliver humanitarian aid, and they said they were going to back off their nuclear program. A couple of weeks later, they want to launch a satellite with the technology that's the very technology at issue for an intercontinental ballistic missile, basically scuttling that deal. And there's a real possibility, I don't necessarily think a likelihood, but certainly a plausible possibility that North Korea could go south, no pun intended, and that things could heat up there and that you could see full-on military conflagration on the Korean Peninsula. God forbid, but it is a possibility. Taiwan is another. I mentioned that national reunification is a core interest, and Taiwan is a core interest, therefore, of the People's Republic of China. But there's this little problem from the Chinese vantage, and that is that the United States, every couple of years, sells substantial quantities of arms to Taiwan, and the Chinese view it a little bit like, how would we react if the Chinese sold arms to Colorado or to some U.S. state? So again, from the Chinese vantage, very serious political problem. It's a tremendous source of tension in our relationship, and potentially, it's something that could generate military conflict. China has stated that if Taiwan were ever to declare independence, it would take military action to prevent it from becoming independent. It would go to war. And the United States has said, in various phraseologies, we take a real interest in that eventuality, and we're not quite sure how we would react. And we've referred to that policy as strategic ambiguity, hoping that not telegraphing what we would do might be a deterrent to the Chinese. But the fact is, just from those few sentences of explication, you can see that there is a lot of tension around Taiwan. So this region is really important both to China and to the United States. Recently, President Obama unveiled what he referred to, or what his administration has referred to, as a pivot to Asia. You know, for many years now, for a decade or more, the United States has been deeply involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've wound down our military involvement in those conflicts, or are in the process of doing so. But the fact is, those have been central focal points of U.S. foreign policy, along with the war on terrorism more broadly, in the wake of 9/11. And we haven't, in a certain sense, paid, some would argue, the requisite attention to the Asia-Pacific region, because we've been bogged down in Central Asia, we've been focused on the Middle East and other areas of the world. President Obama has said it's time to look, as a nation, it's time for us to look at the Asia-Pacific region, because our future, and these are not his words, but this is a fair paraphrasing of his message, our future really lies in the Asia-Pacific region, for all the reasons that I've mentioned. So he was in the region in November on a major trip where he unveiled this pivot. He spoke to the Australian Parliament in much the way that our allies and closest friends occasionally will have the honor of coming and speaking to a joint session of Congress. And he announced in that speech that the United States was going to be significantly reducing our military footprint everywhere in the world, or on the whole, except in the Asia-Pacific region. And that was a remarkable statement that really shows that, in a sense, the administration is putting their money where their mouth is, saying, not only do we mean it with words, we're going to modify national budgets and defense budgets to give expression to the idea of an Asia pivot. And so the United States now is really looking more strategically at Asia. I should note, I used to work on something called APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which is a group of 21 major economies in the world, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and a bunch of economies in East Asia, basically economies that have a Pacific coast, China obviously being among them. In the APEC, the 21 APEC economies, I remember from my time in that office, account for 40% of the world's population, 50% of the world's trade, 60% of global GDP, and 70% of economic growth in the world in recent years. So this is an area that is absolutely critical for many reasons, but those pieces of data, I think, point up just how central it is to our future from an economic standpoint. So let me segue then into what the U.S. interests are in the Asia-Pacific region, and what this pivot really means in that regard. I think in very broad terms, it's clear that, sort of from a doctrinal standpoint, what are the big picture things that the United States wants to see in Asia? And here I mean Asia as in Asia Pacific. Number one, we want to see peace, because if there are wars going on there, whether it's around North Korea, whether it's Taiwan, or South China Seas, or any number of other scenarios where it would be less likely than probably North Korea, that's not going to be good for anyone. It's going to be bad for trade. It's obviously going to take a toll in terms of human life. We, the United States, have lost a huge number of American lives in Asia. It's personal to us. And so we want peace in Asia. We also want to see stability. Stability means open trading lanes, predictability, countries acting the way that they say they're going to act, no big surprises, and therefore no big spikes in the price of resources and minerals and things like that. We also want to see the development of the region. In fact, I think it was Ryan, the student at the back table there, who made a very good point when we were talking at dinner about China and its importance to the United States from an economic standpoint. And in fact, it is critical. Actually, U.S. exports to China have increased dramatically in recent years. By the way, China's exports to the United States have also increased pretty dramatically, and we still have an enormous trade deficit with China. But the fact is, we are exporting a lot more to China than we ever have, and a lot of American jobs to the tune of millions, including here in Colorado and all over the country, depend on that. So development, the development of China, the development of other developing nations and emerging economies matters to us, because as people become more prosperous, they're better able to afford American goods and services. And we try to open markets and create those trade flows and export flows. So development is important. And I would finally, I would note freedom of navigation in those waters south of China, the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca. Very important, because an enormous percentage of world trade goes through a very narrow strait, the Strait of Malacca, and also through the South China Seas, which are disputed waters, where several countries have claims to those waters. But keeping those waters open and keeping trade free and flowing is a very serious interest of the United States. So in all of these regards, I would say that U.S. interests in Asia at the level of doctrine, at the level of our broadest goals, match up rather well with China's interests. We don't have too many fundamental conflicts of interest, because in some ways we want some of the same things. We want peace, we want stability, we want development, we want open trade and sea lanes, because both of our economies depend on those things. And so we have a commonality of interest around those issues. And that's what led President Obama and Chinese President Hu Jintao to say a year ago, when President Hu came to visit the United States, the following two statements. And this was in a written joint presidential statement that articulated our basic philosophy of how we view the other country. So the United States wrote in an official joint statement, quote, "The U.S. welcomes a strong, prosperous, successful China that plays a greater role in world affairs." That's what President Obama himself stated. And President Hu, in turn, said, quote, "China welcomes the United States as an Asia-Pacific nation," there's that phrase again, "that contributes to peace, stability, and prosperity in the region." So at a doctrinal level, the two countries basically welcome each other's involvement and want to deal with each other productively and constructively. Where you sometimes, and in fact where we do see disagreements, and this gets me into the sort of last main section before just a few concluding thoughts, is going down one level from doctrine, going down from the notion of peace and stability and development to the next level of issues, which is basically our specific interests. And then the third level, how do we, as two different nations, with two very different historical contexts and neighborhoods and so on. How do we achieve those interests? It's in these two areas that you see some of the greatest conflict between the United States and China. So sure, we want peace, we want stability, we want development, we have reasons for wanting those things, and pretty much everyone wants those things, with a few exceptions. There are a few outliers in the world, that, including terrorists and arguably some of the rogue regimes that may not want peace, but most nations do. But the next question is the one where the problem arises. So what are our specific interests and how do we achieve them? And I'll sort of conclude my presentation with a brief reference to these issues. What are the key issues in the Asia-Pacific region that generate the complexity that we see in the U.S.-China relationship? What generates the tension? What do we fight over verbally and diplomatically? There are a number of issues, and I'll lay them out. I think there are 4 or 5 things that are worth noting. As a preface to that, let me also add that there's another dynamic here, and that is there are perhaps differing levels of intensity with respect to how we view the Asia-Pacific region. Bear in mind that even though China regards the United States as, quote, an Asia-Pacific power, as I just cited, the fact is the Asia-Pacific region is really geographically home to China. That's where they are. They border a bunch of other countries there. It's not an abstraction. It's not a place that they have to sail across the world's largest ocean to get to. It's there. It's right there. And so everything that happens in that region is happening on China's doorstep and is happening in China's immediate neighborhood, basically like the house next door. For the United States, it's a different scenario. The region matters to us enormously, as we've talked about. But at the same time, it's many thousands of miles away from Hawaii, let alone the west coast of the United States. And when we talk about a country like North Korea and the possibility that North Korea may acquire nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them great distances, which at present they don't have the latter. They have nuclear weapons, but they don't have the ability to reach the United States, thank God. So we have a kind of distance from North Korea, from the North Korean issue, that China doesn't have the luxury of having. We also have a kind of distance from Taiwan for the same geographic reasons that China doesn't have. And in short, if something really heats up in East Asia, it's not on our doorstep. So there is an asymmetry in the intensity of interests, I would argue. One could, to use the Chinese terminology, they view the world through the prism of core interests. One could make the argument that while we have important or even critical interests in Asia, it might be said that we don't necessarily have core interests in Asia. North Korea is a problem, but at this moment in time, they can't hurt anyone in the United States. Yes, we have armed forces in South Korea and Japan. Certainly those in Korea are within the range of North Korea's military forces. But on the whole, the American population is much more removed from the problem. That asymmetry gives rise to some of the tensions we see play out as well. Now, with that being said, let me just flag a couple of issues and then I'll conclude. So I think the key issues on the U.S.-China agenda with respect to the Asia-Pacific region, which is what I'll focus on here, can kind of be named on one hand. First and foremost, I think there's the issue of Taiwan. As I mentioned, for China, this is existential. For China, the Chinese leadership could never abide and have stated that they never will abide or allow the independence of Taiwan. That is to say, Taiwan declaring itself to be an independent nation. China has stated very specifically, and I think credibly, that if that were ever to happen, they would go to war to stop it. And I don't think any serious military analyst in the world that understands the relative capabilities of the mainland versus the capabilities of Taiwan would have any doubts as to what the ultimate outcome of a fight would be. So Taiwan is a very serious issue, and with respect to the United States and China, the issue specifically is that the United States periodically sells several $billion worth of arms, including arguably some fairly sophisticated equipment, to Taiwan, pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a law that was passed in 1979 that stipulates and mandates that the United States must, by law, sell defensive articles and services to Taiwan as required for Taiwan's self-defense. So the United States would be in violation of the law if it didn't sell armaments to Taiwan. China isn't so wild about that. And we have enormous problems in our bilateral relationship because of that. One of the consequences of that is that our militaries, the United States and the Chinese military, don't have the relationship and the communication that we ought to have as two very important world powers, certainly a superpower, but also an important regional power. Because China objects so strenuously to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, in protest of those sales, they often shut down the relationship and make it impossible for us to engage in exchange so that we can get a better understanding of Chinese military thinking and China can get a better understanding of ours. That, in turn, deepens the mistrust when you don't have those communications and you get a kind of negative cycle of mistrust. So Taiwan is a very significant problem in Asia. North Korea, we've mentioned. Here again, we'll use that rubric, the three levels: doctrine, interests, and tactics. At the level of doctrine, the United States and China agree on North Korea, 100%. Neither the United States nor China wants a nuclear North Korea. Both of us want a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. We've stated that. That's doctrine. At the level of interest in tactics, the question starts to be, how do we get there? And in this regard, the United States and China have very differing points of views. To put it rather simply, but I think accurately, the United States has basically taken the position that we need to be tough with North Korea. And that means sanctions. It means taking North Korea to task when it sank a South Korean battleship and killed 46 people, which by any definition is literally an act of war. But North Korea did it. The United States and many other countries were quick to level extremely harsh criticism, which I think was very appropriate. But China refused to join in that chorus of critics and refused to condemn that action. So they took a very different point of view. So how we get there tactically is an area where the United States and China have disagreed on North Korea. That remains a serious problem or issue, I would say, in the relationship. The South China Sea is another significant issue. As I mentioned, there is a section of sea southeast of China that China claims significant swaths of, but so do Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Taiwan and the Philippines. And if you look at a map with all the claims, it overlaps in a way that you can't make heads or tails of. Everyone wants the same patch of water. And they want it for a number of reasons, not least because there are some extremely valuable energy and mineral resources on that seabed. So that's a question where the United States takes the view that those sea lanes must remain open. China takes the view these are our waters. They don't try to enforce that view, but they take the view that these waters belong to us. There's a real conflict over those two visions, and that has generated some tensions in recent years. So South China Sea is another one. Finally, I think I would say, and there are a couple of, we could talk about Burma uh, or a few other relatively minor issues from the standpoint of U.S.-China relations. But the last one I would mention that I think is important is the whole question of trade. In years past, I go back long enough to remember, as some of you in this room might as well, President Clinton's first run for the presidency in 1992. And the notion of China coming into a presidential campaign and the tough rhetoric goes back a long way. That was the first presidential election after Tiananmen of 1989. And I remember very clearly that Governor Clinton at that time was really blasting China on human rights. Didn't say a word about trade. I think if you looked back at his transcripts of his public statements as governor, as candidate for president, I don't think there was a single reference to trade. It was all human rights. Fast forward 20 years to today. So we have a Republican primary unfolding. In fact, as we sit here, I don't know if any of you have gotten on your cell phones the Illinois results, but there was a big primary in Illinois today. And Romney and Gingrich and Santorum and Ron Paul from my beloved home state of Texas are in the mix and competing for votes. What's really interesting about this particular GOP race, or this particular primary, irrespective of its party, is that there's zero mention of human rights with respect to China and a lot of mention of the trade issues. So Romney has gone so far as to say, and he's been most vocal on this particular issue because economics and trade and prosperity are very much at the core of his campaign themes. He has said two things about China repeatedly in debates and speeches and in many other contexts. Number one, he's kind of famously said, on day one, when I take the oath of office and become president of the United States, I will have China listed as a currency manipulator, and that will give us the tools we need to crack down on China for undervaluing its currency, the renminbi, and that will immediately start to show benefits in terms of the balance of trade and more U.S. exports to China. He said that. On day one, I will label China a currency manipulator. Those were his words. He's also said, and this is really interesting, and I don't think anyone has pointed this out yet, so kind of note to self, I need to write a little article about this. Please don't beat me to it, anybody, because I think this is an interesting point. He has said, the national budget of our country, the federal budget, is very much at issue in this campaign. Everyone's talking about it. President Obama and the Democrats in Congress and the candidates for president on the Republican side, everybody. It's a big issue. We have $15 trillion in debt. China holds about $1 trillion of it, and they are the largest holder of our debt. So the whole question of spending is central to this race. And here is what Romney has said on spending. He said, the acid test of whether we should spend U.S., and these are not his exact words, but this is definitely his message. The acid test of whether the United States should spend your tax dollars, our tax dollars, is this spending priority important enough for us to borrow from China to spend? If it's important enough that we're willing to borrow from China to get the money to do it, then let's do it. If it's not important enough that we're willing to borrow from China, then we shouldn't do it. Now that is an absolutely remarkable statement. At face value, Governor Romney, a serious front-running candidate for president of the United States, is saying that the defining question about how we spend federal dollars is whether we have to borrow from China. Now, the point that I would make is, I think it's an interesting point that he makes. I think it's a memorable point. But it also shows how kind of deeply under the skin of the United States and the American people China has gotten. You know, and let me riff one other little story in that you may or may not have heard or remembered from Pennsylvania. It was late last year, snow was on the ground, football season, NFL, and the Vikings were supposed to go play in Philadelphia. And for the first time in decades, the game was snowed out. Literally, they canceled a Monday night football game. It's the only time in my lifetime I've ever remembered that happening. And Governor Rendell said, and I quote, "We have become a nation of wusses." He said, if this were China, they would have had armies of volunteers on the street clearing out the snow, and they would have been doing calculus problems on the way to the stadium. That's what Governor Rendell said. That's almost an exact verbatim quote. He said, we've become a nation of wusses. China is, in essence, tougher than we are. So these kinds of comments go to two things. Number one, how deeply embedded China has become in the American psyche and in the American political discourse. And back to my point, how important China has become as a topic in the context of trade, which is this fourth really big issue that disproportionately is about the Asia-Pacific region. So let me conclude by just saying, and I think we'll have about 10 or maybe 15 minutes for questions. Let me conclude by just saying, I think there is broad, although not complete, doctrinal convergence between the United States and China. There is, in many ways, a fairly substantial commonality of interests with some exceptions. Syria, for example, being one, Iran arguably being another. But there's generally a pretty good commonality of interests. However, there are very diverging perspectives on some key issues, and in particular, on the tactics of how we get from point A to point B. There is an inherent tension between the United States and China owing to the size of the two countries, owing to the growth trajectories, and I would say the rather different economic growth trajectories of the two countries, and also owing to the enormous complexity of the bilateral agenda between the United States and China. I don't think any two countries that deal with each other have to deal with each other around a more complex agenda than the United States and China. And so the complexity of it, the size and scope, the trajectory, these things complicate the dynamics. There's a saying or a sort of an adage in international relations that when you talk about threats, you have to look at two things, capability and intent. And remarks like those made by Governor Rendell, or even those by Governor Romney, with respect to the notion of making China the central fulcrum of decision-making about federal spending, there is a notion of threat that is looming out there. And so if we break that down, the question becomes, again, capability and intent. Today, in a military sense, China doesn't have a real capability of threatening the United States in the way that, just from a hardware standpoint, Russia does. It doesn't have that same size nuclear arsenal and so forth. And I'm not saying that Russia is a threat to the United States, but at least it has the hardware that, if it ever wanted to be, those are some pretty significant pieces of hardware, nuclear weapons. So in a military sense, it's not necessarily a threat at this time. Economically, I think there's a great sense across our country that there is a real threat. And then there's the question of intent. And I think it's around that question of intent that we see the most fundamental conundrum and problem in U.S.-China relations. And that is that basically the United States doesn't trust China, and basically China doesn't trust the United States. And I should note that at the East-West Institute, the think tank in New York, the foreign policy think tank in New York for which I work, that's what we try to work on, is to try to build strategic trust between the United States and China so that we can at least deal with the intent part of the equation. The capability part is way beyond our ability to deal with. But the intent is about trust, and trust is perhaps the greatest deficit in the U.S.-China relationship. I think the United States and China, in conclusion, are not preordained to be either friends or foes, but achieving the former rather than the latter is something that is going to take great vision, great foresight, and a lot of hard work. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank all of you very much for your attention and for giving me the generous gift of your time. And I look forward very much to taking your questions and comments. Thank you.
Knowing what you know about the Chinese psyche, do you think that the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea would have been important had they not found the petroleum or presumed that there was petroleum there?
Very good question. And the Spratlys are very much at the epicenter of their claims. And I think the answer is yes, they still would have been important because psychically for the Chinese, territorial integrity really matters to them. There's an idea that I've been working on over the years a little bit, which really just means I've been thinking about it. I actually haven't done any work on it yet, and I'd like to. But it's the notion of diplomacy as psychology. I've made the point, by the way, my sister in Loveland is a psychologist, and I've kind of gotten some exposure to that discipline. And I've come to the conclusion that you can learn more about how nations deal with each other from the writings of Freud than you can from the writings of Clausewitz. And that's because nations are run by governments, and governments are collections of people like us. And people have come through school and read history books and have internalized the history of their nation. And there are things that happen in a nation's history that are very scarring. And the thing that happened in Chinese history that was most scarring was the carving up of China in the 1800s principally, and into the early 1900s. And when the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they basically said, never again. We will never, ever allow our country to be carved up like a birthday cake, with this country getting special concessions here and that country getting to have a special consul here. And it just is not something they would ever tolerate. For that reason, because of a psychic concern, because of a scarring in China's history, and a psychic concern almost bordering on an obsession with territorial integrity and sovereignty. No one can tell us what to do. That mindset. For that reason, those islands would have been important anyway. That said, the fact that there are some enormously valuable mineral deposits on that seabed, to say nothing of perhaps some important things under the seabed, that only adds to it. But even without that, if it was just a rock in the water, which in fact some of those islands are, that issue would have been very, very important to China for the psychic reasons that I've mentioned. And I think you're right to frame the question as one about the Chinese psyche, because I think that's what drives it. Thank you.
Next question's right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct me if I'm incorrect, but most of us here in this room have got enough gray hair. We remember when Russia was the Communist Party of the world, and they fell flat on their face with their economy. Is it true then that the Chinese are much less of a dictatorship and more concerned about their people, and they have a better chance of surviving than Russia did with all of their, how many are the states, what there are?
Yeah.
I mean, Russia couldn't do it. You think China can?
In short, yes, and the reason is because of very significant differences in the way that China has governed, both on the economic and the political side, relative to the way the Soviet Union did. Now, basically, the Chinese have this social contract of economic freedom. Do what you want, travel where you want to go. You want to work for Cisco, work for Cisco. You want to work for Dell Computer, work for Dell Computer. You want to buy stuff, buy an apartment, buy a car, buy computers. Do your thing. China has something like 450, probably soon 500 million internet users. They've got nearly that number of cell phone users. Both of those figures exceed the entire population of our country by a good margin. So economically, laissez-faire for the most part. There are certain strategic industries that are not free market, but the majority of the Chinese market is driven, majority of the Chinese economy is driven on the market mechanism. That was not true in the Soviet Union. So there's been an enormous level of wealth creation in China that has created an enormous leap forward in terms of prosperity, in terms of incomes, in terms of material goods, in terms of basically quality of life for virtually, well, let's say the overwhelming majority of Chinese. Some have risen much faster than others, make no mistake. But everyone is doing better, pretty much, than they were 30 years ago. And they see that. So there's an enormous difference between China and Russia with respect to the question of economic governance. This leads to another point that I would make that I think is significant. And that is, I think historically, most observers of China, or observers of the world, and including the Soviet Union and the dictatorships of communist Europe and so on, tended to see an inherent nexus or relationship between democratic governance and market economics. That the two had to go hand in hand because, in essence, the two are both about choice. The Chinese have come to a different conclusion. And the results of what China has done create an interesting conceptual question. And that is, if you've got a dictatorship, which China has, where you have senior leaders that are not accountable to voters in the way that our politicians are ultimately accountable to we the people and we the voters, then you have leadership in China that can come in, that can know that leadership, certainly the top two leaders, will serve for 10 years, pretty much no matter what. And then they can make decisions for the country on a 10-year time horizon or even a 20-year time horizon in a way that members of the United States Congress and U.S. presidents would never, ever have the luxury of being able to do. Because they're not accountable to voters. And they're not on a 2, 4, or 6-year cycle. And they can make tough decisions about their economy and wrenching decisions about their economy, like tearing down the entire social safety network. And there's not a darn thing anyone can do about it. And it might be that decision happens to be for the good of the country, or it generates growth. And they're not having to respond to voters in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and right down the line. So in a sense, the absence of democracy, which I think most of us would regard as inherently a bad thing from an American vantage, from the standpoint of crafting coherent and forward-looking public policy, may actually be, in a perverse way, a kind of advantage. And I would argue that that's something that is out there now, and you see some of that discussion, including from Zach Karabell. Dave was kind enough to send me a really interesting blog that Zach Karabell, a great scholar of China's economy, wrote recently that makes a similar point, not quite in the same way. But I guess the phrase that I might coin is there a dictatorship dividend in terms of crafting long-term public policy? If you don't have to worry about getting voted out of office, maybe you can make the tough decisions. We sure don't seem to be able to make them very well here. Now, I love democracy. I wouldn't want to live under any other form of government. But let's be honest. In terms of public policy performance, we've generated an enormous debt. We're not willing to pay for what we're getting as a people. So there's a lot of interesting questions here that I think we ourselves have to do some soul searching. And that's a separate topic on U.S. domestic politics. But as far as China, the reason I think it's not Russia, or the Soviet Union, is that they're managing the economy in a way that was vastly different from the Soviet Union. They're keeping the lid on politically, which is something that pains us Americans to see, but they're doing it for their reasons. And they're creating enough space in society for some level of innovation around the internet, around the new economy, and they're seeing results. They're seeing economic results. And as long as those economic results are delivered, my sense is the Communist Party is going to be in power for as long as those results are delivered. Because I think that's what the operative social contract really is.
We have a question here in the back, and then we'll just have time for one more question when we go over to the east side of the room.
Okay, and I'll be happy to stick around for a few moments afterwards if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask after the event proper. So thank you.
I am wondering if you view the U.S.'s continued support of Taiwan and China's continued support of North Korea as relics of the Cold War. And then going forward, do you see both countries being flexible in altering their support of those two respective countries?
Good question. And in short, there was a Cold War element to the dynamic between mainland China, Taiwan, and the United States. But I don't think principally that it is a vestige of the Cold War, because I think there's a different dynamic now. The different dynamic now, and just quickly going back to the history, and we were talking with the students about the importance of history just a while ago. In 1949, there wasn't an issue of Taiwan. There was the Chinese Civil War. People fled to Taiwan, created an alternate regime called the Republic of China. It's still called the Republic of China by its own government and its own people. And then there's the People's Republic of China on the mainland. So it goes back to 1949. And I think the dynamic today is, at that time, Taiwan was no more a democracy than communist China was. It was every bit as much a dictatorship as communist China was. What happened in the interim is somewhere along the way, specifically in 1996, Taiwan became a democracy and voted, and the 23 million people, or 21 million at that time, came together and did something we cherish the blessing to be able to do, and that is they voted for their choice of candidates for president. And in 96 they did, in 2000, 2004, 2008, and again this spring. So Taiwan has now had 5 democratic, free, fair elections for president and for their legislature and others. The dynamic now is that the United States, and I think the American people broadly, but certainly the U.S. Congress unquestionably, and the U.S. executive branch in its own way, feel a very special kinship and bond with Taiwan, because it is a place that, while we don't recognize as a matter of national policy Taiwan as a country, we don't have, quote, diplomatic relations, we don't have, quote, an ambassador in Taiwan. The fact is, we regard Taiwan as a friend and a fellow democracy. And the United States, the American people, and the United States Congress, more than any other entity, cares a lot about the fate of that democracy. And I think that is what is driving the U.S. position. I don't think it's about Cold War. I don't think it's about containing China. It's just that we feel a kindred spirit, a kindredness of spirit with Taiwan. From the Chinese standpoint, finally, they will never budge on the issue, because I believe that for the Chinese leadership, they regard Taiwan as a kind of proxy, to use a bit of a cliche from the China history discourse. Taiwan is kind of a mandate of heaven thing. In the old empires of old, if there was a terrible drought or flood, it demonstrated to the people that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, and therefore it was okay to overthrow the emperor. And that's how people then sort of interpreted things, and even the emperors and their cabinets, if you will. But I think that, in my opinion, and I think in the analysis of others, the communist leadership looks at Taiwan and believes if they ever were to lose Taiwan, they would lose the mandate of heaven. It would set off a domino effect vis-a-vis other parts of China, and it would be the end of China as we know it, as they know it today. So they'll never budge a single millimeter ever on sovereignty and national reunification. And the United States, I don't think, is going to budge much on the question of democracy. And it was Congress that imposed the obligation, the legal obligation, to sell defensive arms to Taiwan. And it's a tough issue. We work on this issue a little bit, and the issue's been around and been difficult for 30 years, and it's going to take a while longer, and it's going to take very bright young people like the folks sitting at that table back there another period of time to resolve it. Yes, ma'am. One more question. Yes, ma'am.
Some economists feel that a lot of the Chinese production should go to the local consumers as opposed to export. What's your view on that?
Well, I think there's now been an enormous shift in the basic structure of the Chinese economy, where up to this point it's been primarily driven by exports. And that is to say, China's growth has come because China has been extremely successful at exporting goods that are, inexpensive and important in everyday life. I don't think any of us probably, don't have some item of Chinese clothing on us or in our handbags or whatever. And so it's very much bound up with the daily economic life of the American consumer and consumers all over the world. And that was the path to growth. What they've done with their most recent 5-year plan, the 12th 5-year plan, which is a kind of new beginning, if you will, or let's say a change in emphasis in China's economic structure, is they want to create a more domestic consumption-driven model of growth. And so you see enormous explosions of wealth in China. Many millions of people, some of whom I know personally, quite a few of my good friends there, overnight became multi-millionaires in US dollar terms because the houses that they had been gifted by the government in a one-time gift went onto the market, and all of a sudden, would have made Las Vegas blush during its heyday. They went up many thousands of percent in a span of 3-4 years. And it created an enormous amount of wealth. Some wonder whether there's a bubble there, but the fact is there's a lot of wealth. And so the Chinese leadership is trying to get people to take that wealth, consume it, spur domestic production. And this goes hand in hand with some of the other structural changes that are in place. So I think that is the direction that the Chinese leadership wants to see it go. And that's the direction the United States wants to see China go, because increased consumption in that 1.35 billion person market is good for American ranchers, farmers, businesses, and companies, and workers. And so here again, there's a confluence of interest, but there's a lot of tactical differences about how we get there. So these are terrific questions. I'm very happy to stick around a little while longer. I'm cognizant of the late hour, and I want to be respectful of the venue as well, and they probably need to close at some point. But thank you all so much for the wonderful questions and the hospitality. Very grateful. Thank you.